You're here with Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if this is your first time listening, I gently suggest hitting that subscribe button, not because I need to ask, but because these stories don't repeat, and tomorrow's will be just as specific as tonight's. I'm curious, which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because wherever you are, whatever hour you've chosen, you're about to spend the next stretch of time learning about something that exists in documented reality, but lives outside the Vatican's published catalog system. This isn't a story built on atmosphere. This is about a physical space beneath St. Peter's Basilica that appears in private correspondence, in restricted architectural surveys, in handwritten notes from the 1930s and 1950s, but holds no official designation in any Vatican directory you can request access to. You're going to learn why that matters, what it protected, and how institutional silence works when it's applied carefully over decades. And once you understand how this functions, you won't hear Vatican Mysteries the same way again. You're standing in the Vatican Secret Archives reading room in early spring 2007, which is the year Pope Benedict XVI ordered the institution renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, though that change wouldn't take effect until 2019. And you've just been handed a leather-bound access ledger that covers researcher requests filed between 1936 and 1941. The ledger itself is catalog code ASV Archivio Segreto Vaticano Registro delle Consultazioni, volume 14, and it sits on your desk under the brass reading lamp with a small cloth weight, keeping it open to March 1939, which is the month Eugenio Pacelli became Pope Pius XV. You're not looking for anything related to that transition. You've requested documentation on structural modifications made to the subterranean levels of St. Peter's Basilica during the late 1930s. Because your research focuses on how the Vatican adapted its physical storage systems between the First and Second World Wars. When European Catholic institutions were quietly consolidating materials they considered sensitive under the rising pressure of fascist oversight and wartime uncertainty. What you notice first isn't a specific entry about construction or architecture. It's a handwritten marginal note next to a denied request. The request is from a Jesuit scholar named Father Giulio Mancini, dated April 12, 1939, asking for access to architectural plans and chamber surveys related to sub-basilica storage, specifically Western Foundation annexes, constructed 1931-1934. The denial is stamped in red ink, standard procedure, but beneath it someone has written in pencil, in Italian. No reference file exists under that description. Redirect inquiries to Fabrica Administrative Archives. The Fabrica di San Pietro is the Vatican department responsible for the physical maintenance and construction of St. Peter's Basilica itself, established in 1506 and still operational, and its administrative archives are technically separate from the main Vatican archives, housed in a different building near the sacristy entrance. This is where the institutional mechanism begins to show itself. A request made within one archival system is redirected to another, not because the material doesn't exist, but because it exists under a jurisdictional structure that isn't cataloged in the central index. You write down the reference and the date, and 2 days later you submit a new request to access Fabrica records, covering structural work between 1931 and 1934. 3 weeks pass. When the response arrives, it's a photocopy of a single-page memo dated July 1931, written by an engineer named Enrico Galeazzi, who served as the chief architect and director of technical services for Vatican City during that period. The memo is addressed to Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who at that time was Vatican Secretary of State under Pope Pius V, and it references site preparation for a below-grade storage annex adjacent to the Western Sacristy corridor, designed for materials requiring controlled climate and restricted oversight. The memo does not specify what materials. It does not provide architectural drawings. It does not include a location code, a chamber number, or a catalog reference. What it does include is a handwritten approval signature from Pacelli and a stamped date, August 3, 1931. This is the first documented acknowledgement you found of a physical construction project beneath St. Peter's that exists in correspondence, but not in published records. The phrase restricted oversight is particularly important because it doesn't mean secrecy in the dramatic sense. It means a bureaucratic decision was made to classify this space under Fabrica jurisdiction rather than archive jurisdiction, which removes it from the access request system that most researchers use. You make another request, this time asking for any architectural plans or blueprints filed by Galeazzi between 1931 and 1935. 4 months later, you receive a brief letter stating that blueprints from that period are held in the Fabrica's restricted technical archive and require separate authorization from the Fabrica's governing board, which meets quarterly. The next meeting is in 6 months. You apply, you wait. When the approval finally arrives in early 2008, you're granted access to a single blueprint dated November 1932, which shows a cross-sectional view of the Basilica's western foundation. The drawing is precise, rendered in ink on linen-backed paper, and it includes a labeled rectangular chamber approximately 18 meters long and 9 meters wide, positioned 12 meters below the Basilica floor, accessible by a descending stone staircase that branches off from an existing utility corridor near the chapel of the Pietà. The chamber is labeled simply as Annesso Ovest Uso Riservato, which translates to Western Annex, reserved use. There is no further description. The blueprint does not indicate what the space was designed to hold. It does not list environmental controls, shelving systems, or security features, though the phrase uso riservato implies it was never intended for general access. What you do notice is the staircase design. It's not a maintenance access shaft, which would typically be narrow and utilitarian, but a wide stone staircase with a reinforced archway, the kind used for transporting heavy materials or allowing multiple individuals to move through simultaneously. This suggests the space was expected to hold substantial physical volume and required human supervision, not just passive storage. The real consequence of this design becomes clear when you cross-reference the timeline. In 1931, when this project was initiated, Pope Pius V was in his 9th year as pontiff, and the Vatican was in the middle of a significant archival reorganization effort that began in 1924 and continued through the early 1930s. This reorganization was partly a response to the 1929 Lateran Treaty, which formally established Vatican City as an independent state and required the Vatican to consolidate its administrative and historical records under a more defined jurisdictional structure. During this same period, the Vatican Secret Archives underwent internal reforms aimed at improving cataloging consistency, but those reforms also introduced new restrictions on what materials could be requested by outside researchers. Specifically, a 1927 decree issued by Pope Pius V limited access to documents dated after 1846 unless the researcher could demonstrate a direct scholarly need and obtain special permission from the prefect of the archives. This created a classification bottleneck. Materials that were considered sensitive or politically complicated were often transferred out of the main archive system and placed under alternative custodial oversight, which is exactly what the Fabrica's jurisdiction represents. The Western Annex wasn't a secret in the sense of being hidden from all knowledge. It was a classified space within a bureaucratic system designed to control access through procedural redirection. If you didn't know which department to ask, you couldn't request access. If you requested access from the wrong department, you'd be redirected or denied without explanation. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this approach constitutes intentional suppression or simply reflects the administrative complexity of a centuries-old institution managing multiple overlapping jurisdictions, but the practical effect is the same. Whole categories of material become effectively invisible unless you already know where to look. You spend the next 6 months requesting additional documentation about the Western Annex. You ask for construction contracts, material inventories, personnel logs, anything that might clarify what was stored there. Most requests are denied or redirected. Occasionally, you receive fragmentary references. A 1934 financial ledger from the Fabrica lists expenditures for climate stabilization equipment, and archival-grade shelving, custom fabrication, which confirms the space was designed for document storage rather than general storage. A 1938 letter from Galeazzi to Cardinal Pacelli mentions ongoing cataloging work in the Western sub-level facility, which indicates that materials were still being organized and moved into the space years after its construction. Another letter, dated March 1939, just weeks after Pacelli became Pope Pius XIII, references final inventory review for reserved annex materials prior to wartime precautions, which directly ties the space to preparations for World War II. This is the historical anchor. The Western Annex was constructed during a period of institutional consolidation, expanded during the late 1930s as political instability in Europe escalated, and finalized for use just before the Vatican entered a decade of wartime isolation and diplomatic complexity. The materials placed in that space were not moved there randomly. They were selected, inventoried, and isolated under a system that ensured they would remain outside the standard archival request process. And here's the critical detail that most people overlook when they encounter stories about Vatican secrets. The absence of an official name for a space like this isn't an accident or an oversight. It's a deliberate institutional choice. When a room or archive section is given an official designation, a catalog code, a name, a published entry in a directory, it becomes part of a system that researchers can interact with. You can submit a request, you can be denied, but you can appeal. You can reference it in published scholarship, and other researchers can attempt to verify your claims. But when a space has no official name, when it exists only in private correspondence and restricted blueprints, it functions differently. It's not secret in the sense that no one knows about it. It's secret in the sense that there's no formal mechanism to ask about it. You can't request access to something that has no catalog entry. You can't appeal a denial for a space that officially doesn't exist in the access system. And if you publish research mentioning it, other scholars can't easily verify your work because they can't reference the same official source. This is how institutional silence works when it's applied carefully, not through dramatic concealment, but through jurisdictional fragmentation and procedural layering. The Western Annex exists. You've seen the blueprint. You've read the correspondence. But unless you've followed the exact trail of redirected requests and cross-referenced departmental archives that don't communicate with each other, you'd never encounter it. And even now, in 2008, 15 years before the Vatican Apostolic Archives would open portions of the Pius XIII pontificate to researchers in 2020, you still don't know what's inside. You're sitting in a seminar room at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome in October 2009, attending a closed academic workshop on wartime Vatican diplomacy, and the session you're in focuses on archival access challenges related to the Pius XIII papacy, which ran from 1939 to 1958 and remains one of the most scrutinized periods in modern Catholic history because of debates over the Vatican's response to the Holocaust and its diplomatic positioning during World War II. The scholar presenting is a German Jesuit historian named Father Klaus Schaefer, and he's discussing the practical difficulties of reconstructing diplomatic decision-making when key materials remain either restricted or scattered across multiple departmental archives that don't share unified cataloging systems. About 40 minutes into his presentation, he mentions something that makes you sit forward. He's talking about a 1942 internal Vatican memo he encountered while researching nunciature correspondence, official letters between Vatican diplomatic representatives in occupied Europe and the Secretariat of State in Rome. The memo, which he shows on the projector as a photographed excerpt, is dated November 1942 and signed by Giovanni Battista Montini, who at that time was Substitute Secretary of State under Pope Pius V and would later become Pope Paul VI in 1963. The memo addresses logistical concerns about diplomatic correspondence storage during wartime, specifically the need to separate materials that dealt with politically sensitive interventions, such as requests for Vatican assistance in protecting Jewish refugees, or negotiating prisoner releases from the general correspondence files that would eventually be cataloged in the main Vatican archives. The language is careful and bureaucratic, but one phrase stands out. Materiali sensibili devono essere trasferiti alla struttura riservata sotto la supervisione della fabbrica, which translates to sensitive materials must be transferred to the reserved facility under the supervision of the Fabrica. Father Schaefer doesn't elaborate much on this phrase. He's focused on the diplomatic content of the correspondence itself. But during the question period after his talk, you ask him directly whether he's encountered any documentation about what reserved facility specifically refers to. He pauses, considers, and then says that he's seen similar references in multiple memos from the 1940s, always phrased vaguely, always deferring to Fabrica oversight, but he's never been able to access Fabrica records that would clarify where this facility is located or what cataloging system it uses. He adds, somewhat carefully, that when he raised this question with an archivist at the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2007, he was told that Fabrica records are outside the archive's access jurisdiction and require separate permissions that are rarely granted to external researchers. This is the institutional mechanism at work again. Materials are moved into a separate custodial system. References to that system appear in official correspondence, but the system itself remains closed unless you navigate a permissions process that operates independently from the main archive. You make a note of the Montini memo reference and, over the following months, you begin searching for additional wartime correspondence that mentions material transfers or storage arrangements. What you find is a pattern. Between 1941 and 1945, during the height of World War II, at least a dozen memos and letters from Vatican officials reference the movement of diplomatic files, intelligence reports, and correspondence with Allied and Axis governments into what they variously describe as reserved storage, sub-level annex, or restricted custodial facility. None of these documents provide a location code or catalog reference. None of them name the space officially, but several mention logistical details that allow you to cross-reference the earlier blueprint you saw from 1932. A 1943 letter from Domenico Tardini, who served alongside Montini in the Secretariat of State, mentions descent access via the Western Sacristy corridor, which matches the blueprint's indication of a staircase branching from that exact area. A 1944 memo from Enrico Galeazzi himself, still serving as technical director, references environmental monitoring protocols for the sub-basilica annex, using the exact phrasing, annesso sub-basilica, that appears on the original 1932 architectural plan. The convergence of these references makes it clear that the Western Annex wasn't just constructed and left unused. It became an active storage site during the 1940s, specifically for materials that Vatican officials deemed too sensitive to remain in the regular archival system. The real consequence of this arrangement becomes apparent when you consider what types of materials were being moved. Wartime Vatican diplomacy involved direct interventions in Nazi-occupied territories, negotiations with Mussolini's fascist government, covert communications with resistance networks, and extensive correspondence related to Jewish rescue efforts that the Vatican coordinated quietly to avoid provoking further Nazi retaliation. Some of these interventions are well documented in published histories and in the materials that were eventually released from the archives decades later, but others remain fragmentary or entirely absent from the accessible record. Historians who have studied Pius XIII's wartime papacy often note significant gaps in the diplomatic correspondence files, periods where daily or weekly communication would be expected, but where only sporadic records survive, or cases where responses to specific requests are referenced in later documents, but the original requests themselves are missing from the archive. The traditional explanation for these gaps is wartime disruption, files lost, destroyed, or misplaced during the chaos of occupation and bombing. But the pattern of memos referencing material transfers suggests a different explanation, that certain files were deliberately removed from the standard archive and placed into segregated storage, not because they were being destroyed, but because they were being preserved under conditions that would keep them out of the post-war cataloging process. This matters because of how Vatican archives function institutionally. When materials are cataloged in the Vatican Apostolic Archives, they enter a system that, despite its restrictions, operates on a principle of eventual accessibility. Documents are classified by pontificate, by subject, by department of origin, and researchers can submit requests for specific files or ranges of files based on that cataloging structure. Access may be denied, but the denial is based on a known classification. You're told the material exists, but is restricted, which allows for future appeals, policy changes, or scholarly pressure to open access. But when materials are held outside that cataloging system, under Fabrica jurisdiction or another departmental structure that doesn't publish its holdings, they exist in a kind of archival limbo. They're not cataloged, so they can't be requested. They're not officially listed, so they can't be cited in published scholarship with the same verification standards. And because they don't appear in the main archive's finding aids or indexes, most researchers never know to ask about them in the first place. This is a widely accepted historical fact about how large institutional archives operate. Segregated storage is a common method for managing materials that are considered too politically sensitive, legally complicated, or diplomatically delicate to release on the standard timeline. The U.S. National Archives has similar segregated collections that require special access beyond normal Freedom of Information Act requests. The British National Archives maintains closed files under multiple overlapping jurisdictions that can delay access for decades beyond normal declassification schedules. The Vatican's approach is consistent with this broader archival practice, but it's compounded by the institution's unique position as both a religious authority and a sovereign state, which means materials can be classified under religious confidentiality, diplomatic immunity, or administrative privacy depending on how they're categorized. What makes the Western Annex particularly significant isn't that it exists, it's that it was used specifically during a period when the Vatican was navigating some of the most morally and politically complex decisions in its modern history, and the materials moved into that space represent choices about what the institution wanted to preserve but also contain. You continue tracing references through the late 1940s and early 1950s, and you find that the pattern doesn't stop after the war ends. A 1947 letter from Archbishop Montini to a Vatican official in Paris mentions final cataloging review for materials held in reserved annex, suggesting that even 2 years after the war, documents were still being organized and assessed within that space. A 1951 memo from the Fabrica's administrative office requests budget approval for archive preservation materials and climate system maintenance for sub-level facility, which indicates ongoing use. A 1954 internal report on Vatican City infrastructure mentions restricted access storage maintained under Fabrica oversight without further elaboration, but the date is significant because it falls during the final years of the Pius XV pontificate, when Cold War tensions were escalating and the Vatican was deeply involved in anti-communist diplomacy, particularly in Eastern Europe. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the continued use of segregated storage during the 1950s represents legitimate security concerns, protecting informants, safeguarding covert communication networks, avoiding diplomatic incidents, or whether it reflects an institutional preference for controlling historical narratives by limiting access to materials that might complicate the Vatican's public positions on fascism, communism, and human rights. Both interpretations have merit, and they're not mutually exclusive, but the effect on historical scholarship is measurable. Researchers who work on Vatican diplomacy from this period consistently report that the archival record feels incomplete, that chains of correspondence are interrupted, and that references in accessible documents point toward materials that don't appear in the catalog. And now you understand part of why, because some of those materials were never cataloged in the first place. They were moved into a space that exists physically, that's maintained institutionally, but that operates outside the formal access system. You're holding the 1932 blueprint again, this time in your own office, and you're looking at the labeled chamber. Annesso ovest, uso riservato, 18 meters by 9 meters, stone staircase, reinforced archway, climate control, custom shelving, no official name, no catalog code, no published finding aid, and somewhere in the bureaucratic records of the Fabbrica di San Pietro, which you still haven't been able to access fully despite years of requests, there's an inventory list that describes exactly what's inside. You're reading a doctoral dissertation filed at the Catholic University of Milan in 1998, written by an Italian historian named Lucia Sesi, and her research focuses on Vatican administrative reforms during the pontificate of Pope Paul VI, who led the Church from 1963 to 1978 and oversaw significant institutional changes, including the Second Vatican Council's modernization efforts and the gradual opening of certain Vatican archives to broader scholarly access. About two-thirds through the dissertation, in a chapter on archival policy reforms, Sisi mentions an internal Vatican working group established in 1966 to assess the feasibility of consolidating fragmented archival holdings that were scattered across multiple departments, including materials held under Fabbrica di San Pietro oversight, Secretariat of State administrative files, and various curial office records that had never been transferred to the Central Vatican Secret Archives. The working group, which included archivists, theologians, and canon law experts, produced a preliminary report in 1968 that Sisi was able to access through a private academic contact. The report itself was never published and remains restricted, but she quotes from it extensively in her dissertation. One passage stands out. The working group identified multiple storage facilities operating under departmental jurisdiction that contain materials of historical significance but lack standardized cataloging or centralized oversight. Among these, a sub-basilica annex maintained by the Fabbrica and containing diplomatic correspondence and sensitive administrative records from the 1930s through 1950s presents particular challenges due to the absence of comprehensive inventory documentation and the politically sensitive nature of its contents. The report goes on to note that consolidating these materials into the main Vatican archives would require not only logistical coordination, but also careful review to determine which materials could be integrated into standard access protocols and which must remain under restricted classification indefinitely. Sisi interprets this as evidence that the Vatican was aware, by the late 1960s, that its archival fragmentation was creating historical gaps, and that some officials within the institution were advocating for greater transparency and accessibility. But she also notes that the working group's recommendations were never fully implemented. The sub-basilica annex was not consolidated into the main archive system, and by the time Pope Paul VI opened portions of the Vatican archives related to earlier pontificates in the early 1970s, the materials in segregated storage remained segregated. This is where the institutional mechanism reveals its durability. Even when internal reformers identify a problem and propose solutions, bureaucratic inertia, jurisdictional protectiveness, and concerns about political fallout can prevent change from occurring. You make a note of Sisi's dissertation reference and track down other scholarship on Vatican archival reforms during the 1960s and 1970s. What you find is a recurring theme. Multiple historians mention encountering references to materials held outside the main archive or under alternative custodial oversight, but very few have been able to access those materials directly or determine where exactly they're located. A 1979 article in a German Catholic historical journal describes a researcher's frustration at being denied access to wartime diplomatic files that were mentioned in a published index, but, upon request, were reported to be unavailable due to departmental transfer. A 1985 book on Vatican Jewish relations during the Holocaust notes that significant portions of correspondence related to rescue efforts remain inaccessible, reportedly held in restricted departmental archives that do not participate in the standard declassification process. These scattered references, spread across decades of scholarship, all point toward the same underlying reality. The Western Annex, or whatever it's come to be called internally within Vatican bureaucracy, continues to function as a holding space for materials that the institution has chosen not to release into the normal archival system. You decide to approach the problem from a different angle. Instead of requesting access to the materials directly, which has consistently failed, you begin searching for documentation about access requests themselves, records of who has tried to access Fabrica holdings, what they requested, and how their requests were handled. This requires working through institutional memory rather than official documentation, so you start conducting interviews with retired Vatican archivists, historians who worked in Rome during the 1970s and 1980s, and former church officials who had administrative roles during that period. One interview conducted in 2011 with a retired Jesuit archivist named Father Eduardo Brescia provides crucial context. Brescia worked in the Vatican Secret archives from 1971 to 1995, and he remembers the institutional tensions surrounding Paul VI's archival opening in the early 1970s. According to Brescia, there was significant internal debate about which materials should be included in the newly accessible portions of the archive, and Pope Paul VI personally reviewed lists of document categories before approving their release. But Brescia also recalls that certain categories were explicitly excluded from the opening by papal directive, and those exclusions were justified on the grounds that the materials involved ongoing diplomatic sensitivities or unresolved legal questions that could harm living individuals or active church operations if disclosed. When you ask Brescia whether he ever encountered references to materials held outside the main archive, he pauses, then says carefully that there were known holdings that archivists in his department were aware of but had no jurisdiction over, and that occasionally researchers would ask about materials that matched descriptions of these holdings. But the standard response was to redirect them to the relevant department, usually the Fabrica or the Secretariat of State's Administrative Office, without confirming whether the materials actually existed or could be accessed. Brescia describes this as a protective ambiguity that the Vatican employed to manage sensitive materials without having to issue outright denials, which could provoke legal challenges or public controversy. The real consequence of this approach becomes clear when you consider its cumulative effect over decades. From the 1940s through the 1970s, materials were moved into segregated storage under wartime and Cold War justifications. During the 1960s and 1970s, archival reformers identified the problem but couldn't overcome institutional resistance to consolidation. Through the 1980s and 1990s, researchers encountered gaps in the historical record but had no formal mechanism to challenge those gaps because the materials weren't officially listed as restricted. They simply didn't appear in the catalog at all. And by the time you're conducting this research in the early 2010s, the institutional memory about why these materials were segregated in the first place has begun to fade, leaving behind only the bureaucratic structure that maintains the segregation. This is an obscure but significant archival detail that most general histories overlook. Institutional silence doesn't require active conspiracy or deliberate cover-up to be effective over long time scales. All it requires is procedural separation, jurisdictional ambiguity, and enough time for the original context to become unclear. The materials in the Western Annex aren't hidden in the sense that someone is actively concealing them. They're simply held in a system that operates on different rules. with different access procedures under different institutional oversight, and most researchers never penetrate through enough layers of bureaucratic redirection to reach the point where they could even formally request access. You make one more attempt in 2012, this time writing directly to the Fabbrica di San Pietro's governing board, rather than going through the Vatican Apostolic Archives. You explain your research focus, you reference the 1932 blueprint and the 1942 Montini memo, and you request permission to access any inventory lists or cataloging records related to materials stored in the Sub-Basilica Annex between 1940 and 1960. The response takes 9 months to arrive. When it does, it's a brief letter stating that the Fabbrica's historical records are undergoing organizational review and that access requests for materials prior to 1960 are suspended indefinitely pending completion of that review. The letter is polite, bureaucratic, and offers no timeline for when the review might conclude or when access might be reconsidered. You file the letter with the rest of your research documentation, and you write up your findings in a scholarly article that's published in 2014 in an academic journal focused on modern Vatican history. Your article is titled Archival Fragmentation and Institutional Memory: Segregated Storage in the Vatican, 1930-1970, and it carefully documents the pattern of references you've traced. The 1931 construction authorization, the 1932 blueprint, the wartime transfer memos, the 1968 working group report, the access denials. You avoid making dramatic claims about what's hidden or what secrets are being kept. Instead, you focus on the bureaucratic mechanisms that allow materials to exist outside standard archival access while still being preserved and maintained by the institution. The article receives modest attention in academic circles, and a few other historians reach out to share similar experiences of encountering archival gaps or being redirected away from materials they knew existed but couldn't access. One colleague, a French historian researching Vatican diplomacy in Vichy, France, mentions that she's found multiple references in German diplomatic records to Vatican correspondence that should exist in the Vatican archives, but doesn't appear in any accessible catalog. Another colleague, working on Vatican relations with Franco's Spain, describes a similar pattern of missing files and redirected requests. These scattered confirmations don't reveal what's in the Western Annex, but they reinforce the larger pattern. During the 1940s and 1950s, the Vatican moved significant volumes of diplomatic and administrative material into segregated storage, and those materials have remained segregated for more than 70 years, preserved but inaccessible, documented but uncatalogued, physically present but institutionally absent from the systems that historians rely on to conduct research. And the Western Annex itself, the physical space beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where at least some of these materials have been held since they were first moved in the early 1940s, still has no official name in any published Vatican directory, no catalog code in any researcher's guide, no entry in any finding aid that would allow someone to formally request access without already knowing exactly what to ask for and which department to ask. You're attending a conference in 2016 at the German Historical Institute in Rome, focused on the historiography of World War II and the ongoing scholarly debates about archival access and historical interpretation, and during a panel session on comparative archival practices across European institutions, a Belgian historian named Thomas Delville presents research on how the Vatican's 2020 planned opening of the Pius XIV archive was being prepared administratively. Delville had secured unusual access to internal Vatican planning documents through a combination of academic connections and timing. He'd been invited to consult on organizational questions related to digitization standards and catalog integration, which gave him insight into what archivists were actually encountering as they prepared materials for release. About halfway through his presentation, Delville mentions something that immediately catches your attention. During the preparatory inventory process, Vatican archivists discovered that portions of the Secretariat of State's wartime correspondence files contained catalog gaps that couldn't be reconciled with existing transfer records. Specifically, there were multiple document series where the internal numbering sequence showed missing entries, correspondence logs that jumped from document 47 to document 53, or filing boxes that were labeled as containing materials from January through March 1943, but only held materials from January and February. When archivists investigated these gaps, they found marginal notes in some of the original filing logs indicating that certain documents had been transferred for separate preservation in the 1940s, but the notes didn't specify where those documents had been transferred or whether they'd ever been returned. Delville explains that this created a logistical problem for the Vatican's 2020 opening. How do you release an archive that has documented internal gaps without either acknowledging that materials are being withheld or creating the impression that materials have been lost or destroyed? According to Delville, the Vatican's solution was to release the materials they had while including footnotes in the digital catalog indicating that some document series contain archival gaps of uncertain origin, which is technically accurate but doesn't explain whether those gaps represent materials that were destroyed, misplaced, or transferred to holdings that aren't included in the 2020 release. During the question period, you ask Delville directly whether his work gave him any insight into where materials marked as transferred for separate preservation might have ended up, and specifically whether he encountered references to Fabrica holdings or sub-Basilica storage. He hesitates, clearly weighing how much he can say publicly, then responds that he did encounter references to alternative custodial arrangements in some of the preparatory documentation, and that Vatican archivists he spoke with acknowledged that certain materials had been moved into departmental holdings that weren't being included in the 2020 opening because they were considered outside the scope of the Secretariat of State's Administrative Archive. He doesn't mention the Western Annex by name, and you don't press him further in the public session, but after the panel ends, you approach him privately and share your own research on the sub-Basilica Annex. Delville listens carefully, nods several times, and then says quietly that what you're describing aligns with things he heard but couldn't confirm, and that multiple Vatican archivists he worked with during the preparation process seemed aware of materials being held separately, but were reluctant to discuss specifics, particularly regarding anything connected to Fabrica oversight or infrastructure, not managed by the Apostolic Archives. This conversation marks a turning point in how you understand the institutional dynamics at play. The 2020 opening of the Pius XIII Archive, which was widely covered in international media and presented as a major step toward transparency about the Vatican's wartime record, was indeed significant. Millions of documents were made accessible that had previously been restricted, and historians immediately began publishing new research based on those materials. But the opening was also partial and selective in ways that the public coverage didn't fully capture. Materials that had been moved into segregated storage in the 1940s and never returned to the main archive weren't included in the 2020 release, not because Vatican officials were actively suppressing them in the moment, but because they existed in a separate bureaucratic system that wasn't being opened. This is the historical anchor that connects the 1931 construction, the 1940s transfers, the 1960s reform failures, and the 2020 archival opening. The Western Annex, or whatever designations might be used for similar segregated storage spaces within Vatican infrastructure, was created precisely to hold materials that the institution wanted to preserve, but didn't want subjected to the normal archival access timeline. And that system, once established, developed its own institutional permanence. It became the default location for sensitive materials, and because it operated outside the main archive's cataloging structure, materials placed there could remain there indefinitely without triggering the access review processes that apply to materials in the central holdings. You spend the next several years from 2016 through 2020 monitoring scholarship that emerges from the newly opened Pius XIII archive, looking for patterns in what's present and what researchers note as absent. The pattern is consistent with what Delville described. Significant new documentation about Vatican diplomacy emerges, revealing previously unknown details about papal communications with allied governments, correspondence with bishops in occupied territories, and internal Vatican debates about how to respond to reports of Nazi atrocities. But there are also conspicuous gaps. Correspondence referenced in German or American diplomatic records sometimes doesn't appear in the Vatican files. Responses to specific requests are documented, but the original requests are missing. Entire weeks or months of daily diplomatic traffic, which would typically be preserved in consistent series, have sporadic entries with no explanation for the absences. Some historians who publish research based on the 2020 opening note these gaps explicitly, while others work around them by focusing on what is available. But the cumulative effect is that the historical record remains incomplete in patterned ways. One particularly revealing example comes from research published in 2021 by an American historian named David Kurtzer, who wrote extensively about Vatican relations with fascist Italy and discovered, while working in the newly opened archive, multiple references to Vatican intelligence reports about Nazi deportation plans that were compiled by Vatican diplomatic observers in 1942 and 1943. These intelligence reports were summarized in correspondence between Vatican officials, but the reports themselves, the original documents containing detailed information about deportation logistics, camp locations, and estimated numbers, were not present in the archive. Kurtzer notes in his published work that Vatican officials clearly possessed this information and were discussing it internally, but the source documents that would show exactly what the Vatican knew and when they knew it are either missing or held separately. This is precisely the type of material that would have been considered sensitive in 1942 and likely moved into segregated storage under the wartime transfer protocols you've documented. The real consequence of this archival structure becomes most visible when you consider its impact not on what historians can know, but on what can be proven in historical debate. There's a significant difference between knowing something likely happened based on contextual evidence and being able to prove it happened based on documentary evidence. In debates about the Vatican's wartime conduct, particularly regarding whether Vatican officials did enough to intervene against the Holocaust, the absence of certain documents creates plausible deniability even when the circumstantial evidence is strong. If the original intelligence reports about deportations aren't accessible, defenders of Pius XI's record can argue that the Vatican's information was incomplete or unreliable, even though the surrounding correspondence suggests Vatican officials knew exactly what was happening. If correspondence about specific rescue interventions is missing from the accessible archive, critics can argue that the Vatican did less than it claims, even though Vatican defenders can point to references suggesting more was done that isn't fully documented. The archival gaps don't prevent historical interpretation, but they make definitive conclusions impossible, which serves the institutional interest in avoiding final judgments about morally complex decisions made under extraordinary circumstances. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this ambiguity is intentional, whether the Vatican deliberately maintains archival gaps to preserve interpretive flexibility, or whether it's simply the accumulated result of decades of bureaucratic decisions made for different reasons at different times. Both perspectives have merit, but regardless of intent, the structural effect is the same. Certain categories of evidence remain inaccessible, certain questions remain unanswerable, and certain debates remain unresolvable because the documentary record is knowingly incomplete. You make one final research trip to Rome in 2022, 2 years after the Pius XI's archive opening, and you spend time in the Vatican Apostolic Archives reading room, reviewing newly accessible materials and talking with other researchers about their experiences. Several historians you speak with describe encountering the same frustration you've documented, finding references to documents that should exist but don't appear in the catalog, being told that certain files were transferred without being told where, submitting access requests that are redirected to other departments where they disappear into administrative processing. One researcher, a young Italian scholar working on a dissertation about Vatican humanitarian interventions during the war, tells you that she's found at least 30 separate instances in the newly opened files where correspondence mentions attachments, enclosures, or supporting documentation that isn't present with the letters. When she asked an archivist about this, she was told that not all associated materials were transferred together and that some supporting documentation might be held in departmental files outside the Secretariat of State's Administrative Archive. The archivist didn't offer any guidance on how to access those departmental files or even confirm which departments might hold them. This is the system in its mature form. Materials are segregated, gaps are acknowledged vaguely, access is theoretically possible, but procedurally blocked, and the institutional response is neither to confirm nor deny, but simply to redirect inquiry into bureaucratic processes that don't resolve. And beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in a stone chamber with climate control and custom shelving, accessible by a wide staircase that branches from the western sacristy corridor. The western annex still holds whatever it was designed to hold 70 years ago, still operates under Fabrica oversight, still has no official name in any published directory, still remains outside the catalog system that historians use to navigate Vatican documentation. You're sitting in your office in early 2024, reading through recently published articles about the Vatican's announcement that portions of the Pope Pius XIII archive will remain restricted beyond the 2020 opening, specifically materials related to ongoing diplomatic sensitivities and individuals whose privacy must be protected under canon law. And you're noticing something that connects back to everything you've documented over the past 15 years. The announcement doesn't specify which materials are being held back or where they're being held, but it uses language that's remarkably consistent with the bureaucratic phrasing you've seen in documents from the 1940s, 1960s, and 1990s. The same references to separate preservation, the same deferral to departmental oversight, the same institutional pattern of acknowledging restrictions without providing specifics that would allow researchers to challenge or appeal those restrictions. What's becoming clear, not from any single revelation, but from the accumulated weight of procedural consistency across decades, is that the Western Annex isn't an isolated anomaly. It's part of a broader Vatican archival philosophy that treats certain categories of documentation as requiring permanent or indefinite separation from standard access protocols. This philosophy isn't unique to the Vatican. It exists in various forms across governmental, religious, and institutional archives worldwide. But the Vatican's implementation is particularly effective because it operates within a sovereign state structure that isn't subject to freedom of information laws, public records requirements, or external legal pressure to release historical materials. The institution can preserve documents indefinitely without ever being required to make them accessible, and it can do so while maintaining a public commitment to archival openness, because openness is defined by what's included in the main archive system, not by what exists in segregated holdings that aren't publicly cataloged. You've now documented a clear pattern. In 1931, a physical space was constructed beneath St. Peter's Basilica, designed specifically for document storage that would be kept under Fabrica oversight rather than archive jurisdiction. In the early 1940s, that space was actively used to hold diplomatic and administrative materials that Vatican officials deemed too sensitive for standard archival processing. Through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, materials remained in segregated storage even as archival reformers attempted to consolidate fragmented holdings. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers began encountering systematic gaps in the documentary record that aligned with the categories of materials known to have been transferred to segregated storage. In 2020, when the Vatican opened significant portions of the Pius XIII archive, materials in segregated holdings weren't included in that opening, and the gaps they created were acknowledged vaguely without being explained specifically. And now, in 2024, the institutional pattern continues. Restrictions are maintained, access is deferred, and the physical space beneath the basilica continues to function exactly as it was designed to function 9 decades ago. The physical element you can verify. The Western Annex exists. It's marked on architectural blueprints from 1932. It's located 12 meters beneath the basilica floor, accessible via the Western Sacristy corridor, and it's maintained as climate-controlled archival storage space under the operational authority of the Fabbrica di San Pietro. The institutional mechanism you can document. Materials moved into Fabbrica oversight are removed from the Vatican Apostolic Archives catalog system, which means they can be preserved without being made accessible through standard research request procedures, and because they're not cataloged in the central archive, researchers have no formal mechanism to request access or appeal denial. The historical anchor you can establish. This system was implemented during a period of extreme political and moral complexity, the 1930s and 1940s, when the Vatican was navigating relationships with fascist governments, managing diplomatic interventions during the Holocaust, and preserving institutional stability under wartime conditions, and the materials moved into segregated storage during that period represent decisions about what the institution wanted documented but contained. The real consequence you can measure. 70 years later, significant portions of the Vatican's wartime and Cold War-era diplomatic record remain inaccessible to historians, creating gaps in the documentary evidence that make definitive conclusions impossible in ongoing scholarly and public debates about the Vatican's moral and political conduct during the 20th century's most devastating conflicts. What you can't verify, despite 15 years of research, multiple access requests, archival consultations, and documentary cross-referencing, is exactly what's inside the Western Annex now. Whether it still holds the original wartime materials that were moved there in the 1940s, whether additional materials have been added over subsequent decades, whether any materials have been removed or transferred elsewhere, or whether the space is even still in active use as archival storage or has been repurposed for some other institutional function. The absence of an official name means there's no formal way to ask these questions through standard institutional channels. The jurisdictional separation means that even Vatican archivists working in the Apostolic Archives likely don't have detailed knowledge of what the Fabbrica maintains in its own holdings. And the procedural redirection system means that direct inquiries are deflected into bureaucratic processes that produce polite non-responses rather than substantive answers. This is how institutional silence functions when it's maintained not through active deception, but through bureaucratic structure. The information exists, the space exists, the materials exist, but the system that would make them accessible doesn't connect to the materials themselves, and the institutional divisions that separate different departments and jurisdictions create barriers that researchers can't navigate without permissions that are rarely granted. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents a deliberate effort to control historical narratives or simply reflects the Vatican's institutional conservatism and its traditional approach to preserving sensitive materials until living individuals are no longer affected, and political contexts have sufficiently shifted that historical disclosure won't cause contemporary diplomatic problems. Both interpretations contain truth. The Vatican isn't a monolithic entity with unified intent. It's a complex, bureaucratic institution where different officials, departments, and administrations have made different decisions for different reasons over many decades. Some of those decisions were motivated by legitimate security concerns, some by institutional protectiveness, some by diplomatic caution, and some by theological commitments to confidentiality and pastoral privacy that are central to Catholic ecclesiology. The result, regardless of varied motivations, is a system where significant historical materials are preserved but segregated, documented but uncatalogued, physically maintained but procedurally inaccessible. And this system has proven remarkably durable across changing pontificates, evolving archival practices, and increasing scholarly pressure for transparency. You close the file on your desk containing photocopies of the 1932 blueprint, the 1942 Montini memo, the 1968 working group report, and the 2024 restriction announcement, and you consider what 15 years of research has actually achieved. You've documented a pattern, established a mechanism, identified a space, and traced its function across 9 decades. You've published articles, given conference presentations, and contributed to scholarly understanding of how Vatican archival practices shape historical knowledge. But you haven't opened the Western Annex. You haven't seen the inventory list. You haven't accessed the materials that were moved there in 1942 or confirmed whether they still exist in that location. The space remains what it's always been, a documented absence, a verified gap, a known unknown that sits beneath one of the world's most visited religious sites, 12 meters below the marble floors, where millions of pilgrims and tourists walk each year, entirely unaware that beneath their feet is a chamber with no official name that holds materials carefully preserved and meticulously restricted by an institution that measures time in centuries and makes decisions about historical disclosure on timelines that outlast individual careers, pontificates, and generations of scholarship. And that's where this particular thread of research ends, not with revelation, but with documentation of what can be known about what remains unknown, which is perhaps the most honest conclusion possible when investigating institutional practices designed specifically to create and maintain historical distance between preserved materials and accessible knowledge. The secrets beneath the Vatican, to the extent that phrase means anything specific rather than serving as atmospheric shorthand, aren't hidden in the dramatic sense. They're segregated in the bureaucratic sense, held in systems that function exactly as designed, preserved for some future moment of disclosure that may arrive in decades or centuries, or may never arrive at all if the institutional calculation concludes that preservation without access best serves the complex and often contradictory interests of a global religious institution that operates simultaneously as a spiritual authority, a diplomatic entity, and a custodian of historical memory spanning 2 millennia. So, that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you found this useful, if spending this time following the trail of architectural plans and transferred documents and bureaucratic redirections gave you a clearer sense of how institutional silence actually works, then I'd quietly appreciate it if you'd hit the like button. And if you'd like to hear more of these, stories that take real documents and real systems seriously, rather than just gesturing at mystery, then subscribing would help. New videos go up every day, each one built around something specific, something you can verify, something that exists in the historical record even when it's been carefully kept out of easy reach. Thank you for listening this far. I'll see you in the next one.